Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Uche, and today we're going to be talking about the basic settings of photography. We're going to be talking about the bare fundamentals, that's the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture. There's a few questions I get asked all the time. Hey Uche, how did you take this picture? Hey Uche, how do I get similar looking pictures like you do? Hey Uche, what camera settings are you shooting on? The truth is, there isn't one camera setting that works across all different situations. Camera settings are variable. You adjust them according to what situations you're shooting. My goal in this video is to show you the different settings and show you how they affect your individual pictures. And hopefully the next time you go out to shoot, you know what settings to adjust and you know what settings to change to get your desired image. Also, at the end of this video, I'm going to have a brief exercise. I'm going to pop up several images on the screen and hopefully you're going to be able to tell me what settings I use. Think of photography like a triangle with your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture as the pillars of that triangle. Those pillars have their individual roles to play, but they are also codependent on one another. Take shutter speed for example. Your shutter speed is essentially how quickly your camera opens and closes, exposing your camera sensor to light. Your shutter speed is also the fraction you see on your camera setting. It is in relation to 1 second. So when you see 1/50, it's 1/50th of a second. When you see 1/25, 1/125, or when you see 1/125, that's 1/125 of a second. Essentially, what you're shooting determines your shutter speed. If you're trying to freeze motion, then you use a higher shutter speed, but if you're trying to introduce some motion blur or exaggerate a movement, then you use a slower shutter speed. So think of sports or think of kids playing in the park. If you're trying to freeze the action and you're trying to freeze your kid running up or maybe jumping, you use a fast shutter speed because that just snaps a picture. It opens the shutter and closes it really quickly. But if you're imagine if you're taking pictures of a waterfall and you're trying to show all the motion from the water coming all the way from the top of the cliff all the way to the bottom, then you use a slower shutter speed because that emphasizes the motion. Essentially, what to know is the higher the denominator, the quicker your shutter opens and closes and it freezes the motion. The lower the denominator, the more motion blur you introduce to the shot and the more you exaggerate the motion in the picture. Your ISO is your camera sensitivity to light. The lower the ISO number is, the less sensitive your camera is to light. The higher the ISO number is, the more sensitive your camera is to light. So your lower ISOs tend to have darker images and your higher ISOs tend to have brighter images. The thing to know about ISO though, the more you increase your ISO number, the more your picture starts to break down. Most modern day cameras have gotten a little bit better at handling higher ISOs. For instance, right now I'm shooting on the Nikon Z6 and this camera can do exceptionally well at ISO 6400, but my previous camera couldn't do as well at higher ISOs. I would just advise scaling your camera, shoot at higher ISOs, shoot at lower ISOs and see what your camera is capable of handling, because there's no real scale to tell you this is what your camera could do or this is what your camera can't do. I would also generally recommend shooting at lower ISOs on the outdoors or properly lit situations, because remember, the lower ISOs get darker images. So if you're shooting in direct sunlight, you don't want to increase your ISO because that's bright and the sunlight is bright. So you want to decrease your ISOs to like ISO 100, ISO 200, or maybe even ISO 400. If you're shooting indoors, however, you want to shoot at higher ISOs because it's a poorly lit situation. So you want to introduce as much brightness as you can to your image. Aperture. Now the aperture is probably the most confusing of the three settings, but I'll try and do my best to explain. Aperture is the physical opening of the hole in your lens. You can either physically open your lens wider to let in more light or stop your lens down to let in less light. The aperture is also called the f-stop number because it has an f in front of it. So when you look on your camera settings and you see an f2.8 or an f1.4 or an f11, that is your aperture. And here's where it gets tricky. The lower the f-stop number, the wider you are physically opening the hole on your lens. The higher the f-stop number, the tighter you are making the hole in your lens. So essentially, when your aperture is at f1.8, you are physically opening your lens wider than when your aperture is at f11. I know it's counterintuitive and the lower number is opening wider and the higher number is tightening up, but that's just the aperture. And this is why I said it's going to get confusing. The aperture also controls the depth of field of your shot. Essentially, the lower the f-stop number, the more bokeh you're introducing to a shot. And bokeh is essentially just the out of focus element of your background. So when something is in front of your lens, the out of focus element is your bokeh. To recap, the lower aperture means more light a wider lens opening and more things out of focus in the background. The higher aperture means more things in focus, less things out of focus in the background, less light, and a smaller opening on the lens. As we said in the beginning, we're about to have the brief exercise. So how this is going to work is I'm going to flash some pictures on the screen, and I'm also going to have either ISO, shutter speed, or aperture on the top corner. Then I'm going to give you two options, and it's for you to decide. You have 5 seconds which of those camera settings you think that picture was taken at. And that's all from me today, guys. To recap what we learned in this video, we learned about the shutter speed, your ISO, and your aperture. Your shutter speed controls how quickly your shutter goes up and down and controls the motion blur in the picture. Your aperture controls your depth of field, it controls the bokeh in the background, and your ISO is your camera sensitivity to light. The lower the ISO, the darker your images, the higher the ISO, the brighter your images are. If you learned something new, please leave a like button, please comment and tell me what you most enjoyed about this video. Share this with your friends if you did learn something new, and I'll see you lot in the next one. Cheers.